The bone had lodged against a fallen branch, as if it refused to drift any farther downstream. 16-year-old Michael Reeves thought it was deer remains. Hunters often dumped scraps into the Neches River after butchering. The spring current was howe and brown from recent rain, cutting through the flat fields of Hardin County, Texas. Michael stepped closer, nudging the pale shape with the tip of his fishing rod. It rolled in the water. The rounded joint and clean shaft were unmistakable. It was not animal. It was human. Within an hour, a patrol car from the Hardin County Sheriff's Department idled on the gravel road. Yellow tape fluttered along the riverbank. Sheriff Walter Briggs stood with his hat pushed back, watching as the county medical examiner rinsed mud from the surface of the bone. "Adult," the examiner said evenly. "Human femur. Been in the water months at least." Briggs had served the county for 18 years. He had seen bar fights turn deadly and husbands shoot at shadows in drunken panic. But bones in a river were different. Bones suggested planning, disposal, time. By late afternoon, he ordered old missing person files pulled from storage. The list was longer than he expected. Over 2 decades, drifters had vanished. A mechanic passing through in '78. A teenage hitchhiker in '74. A seasonal farmhand no one could trace. Most cases had gone cold within weeks. Now they shared one thing in common: geography. The river fed from creeks that ran past farmland north of town. Briggs marked properties along those tributaries. More than 40 lay within range. One of them belonged to Thomas Hale. 20 miles away, Hale began his day before sunrise. At 5:45 a.m., he stepped onto the porch of his white wooden farmhouse and looked across the pasture. The cattle shifted against the fence, waiting to be fed. The air carried the scent of damp soil and hay. Hale was 48. Broad shoulders, steady eyes, gray at the temples. He had inherited the farm in the late 1950s and had rarely left it since his wife died in 1961. People described him with the same words year after year: dependable, quiet, fair. He sold beef directly to families in town, donated meat to church suppers, charged honest prices. No one questioned why he preferred isolation. No one asked why the cellar beneath his house had been reinforced with a heavy steel door years ago. That morning he fed the cattle, checked the fencing, and returned inside to brew coffee. The kitchen radio carried local news. When the announcer mentioned human remains discovered in the Neches River, Hale paused only briefly. He took a sip, turned off the radio, and continued eating his breakfast. By evening, Sheriff Briggs confirmed the bone had likely traveled from the northern tributaries. Someone had discarded a body upstream. He studied the map again. Farms near the water, burn pits, slaughter sheds. Places where the smell of decay might pass unnoticed. Thomas Hale's land bordered one such creek. After sunset, Hale descended into his cellar. A single bulb illuminated concrete walls and metal rings set into them long ago. The room was dry, cool, deliberate in its construction. He stood there in silence. 20 years earlier, in that same space, he had discovered something about himself. At first it had been improvisation, then repetition, then order. He did not think of himself as cruel. He believed he removed those no one would search for long. Upstairs, the house creaked in the wind. Hale switched off the light and climbed back into the kitchen. Dinner waited on the table: fried meat, beans, sliced bread. He ate slowly, methodically, as he always did. In Hardin County, night settled peacefully over fields and barns, and the man whose land lay closest to the river washed his plate, dried his hands, and prepared for sleep, unaware that a single bone had begun to loosen 20 years of silence. Long before the river gave up its secret, Thomas Hale had already learned how to disappear in plain sight. He was born in 1934 On the same stretch of land he still worked. His father had raised cattle the old way. Manual fences, hand-driven posts, early mornings without complaint. Thomas grew into the rhythm of it. Feed before dawn, repairs by noon, accounts after supper. Routine became discipline, and discipline became identity. When he married in 1958, people said he had done well. Margaret was quiet, practical, church-raised. They never had children. In the summer of 1961, she died of pneumonia after a sudden infection the small county hospital could not control. Hale buried her on a mild August morning. He returned to work the next day. From then on, he kept conversation brief and business precise. He expanded the herd gradually through the 1960s, bought a second refrigerated truck in 1972, and began selling processed beef directly to families instead of relying only on distributors. Customers trusted him because he controlled every step: raising, slaughtering, grinding, packaging. There were no middlemen. He developed a reputation for fairness. If a family fell behind on payment, he allowed installments. If someone questioned the weight, he reweighed the cut without protest. Twice a year, he donated beef for church fundraisers. The pastor once described him as a steady pillar in uncertain times. The uncertainty was real. By the late 1960s, the highways brought strangers through Hardin County. Men looking for oil work, laborers following seasonal harvests, hitchhikers moving between states. Most passed through unnoticed. A few lingered near town, sleeping behind gas stations or under bridges. Hale watched them. He rarely spoke about them, but he disliked what they represented: disorder, unpredictability, intrusion. In his mind, the county functioned best when everyone knew their place. Transients had no place. The cellar beneath his house had existed since his father's time, originally built for storm shelter and storage. In 1962, Hale reinforced it. He poured additional concrete along one wall and installed a thicker interior door under the pretense of protecting preserved goods from humidity and pests. No one questioned it. Rural properties often carried modifications no one documented. The first time had not been planned in detail. In October 1962, a young drifter approached the farm asking for day labor. Hale gave him water and listened. The man said he had come from Louisiana, looking for work at refineries. He had no car, no clear destination. Hale offered temporary employment repairing fence posts before an approaching storm. The arrangement seemed ordinary. That evening, as rain began to fall, Hale suggested the man stay overnight rather than walk back to town. He led him below the house, explaining the cellar would be warmer than the barn. What happened there altered the direction of the next 20 years. Later, Hale would remember not panic, but clarity, a sudden understanding of leverage, control. The drifter had no family in the county, no one who would press hard if he vanished. When Hale realized this, something settled inside him. The body was not found. There was no report filed locally. By the time distant relatives might have wondered, weeks had passed. Hale adjusted. He improved the cellar, metal rings anchored properly into reinforced sections. He refined his slaughter schedule to mask irregularities. He began keeping a small ledger in the kitchen drawer, recording dates and weights in a code that resembled cattle entries. He told himself it was practical, efficient, waste avoided. Over the years, others followed. Not frequently, never impulsively. Sometimes 2 years passed between incidents, sometimes 3. Each victim fit a pattern: isolated, traveling alone, unlikely to generate prolonged search efforts. The farm prospered quietly. Hale paid his taxes on time, renewed permits, maintained equipment. No complaints were filed about his products. No inspections revealed irregularities. If anyone noticed that he avoided discussing certain stretches of time, they kept it to themselves. By 1982, Thomas Hale had lived 2 decades as both provider and predator. The county saw only one version. When Sheriff Briggs reopened the missing person files after the discovery in the river, Hale was repairing a fence line near the northern creek that crossed his land. He paused only once that afternoon, looking toward the water. The current moved steadily south, and for the first time in years, he considered that something might have slipped beyond his control. The first time Thomas Hale killed, it was not planned as a murder. It was, in his mind, a necessary measure. It was October 1962, a cool and damp evening. A young drifter, thin and tired, had approached Hale's farm asking for work. He claimed to have been on the road since Louisiana, walking between towns, seeking employment where he could. Hale offered him water, a warm place to sleep, and a day's labor repairing fence posts. By nightfall, a storm had rolled in. The drifter had nowhere safe to stay. Hale suggested the cellar beneath the farmhouse. It would be warmer than the barn, he explained, and secure. The drifter accepted. Hale led him down the concrete steps, pointing out the storage crates and metal hooks fixed into the walls for securing barrels. "Old storm shelter," he said casually. "Keeps out the wind and rain." Once the man was inside, Hale watched him for a moment, noting the fear of enclosed space, but also the exhaustion in his eyes. He closed the door behind him. A lock clicked. Hale told himself it was precautionary, to prevent the drifter from wandering into the storm. Hours passed. Rain pounded the roof. The drifter, coughing softly, dozed on a pile of straw. Hale moved around the cellar, checking the reinforcements, the hooks, the corners where someone might hide or resist. He saw potential. Power. Control. By morning, he realized the man would not leave alive. Not because of anger, not for money, but because the world outside was indifferent to his disappearance. No one would notice for weeks, perhaps months. This logic, cold and precise, became his justification. The killing was quick and practiced. Hale used tools he understood from his work with livestock. He restrained the drifter efficiently, as he had restrained cattle many times before, ensuring no struggle could cause injury to himself. The act, though horrific in thought, required only calm hands and controlled motions. Afterward, Hale cleaned the cellar. He burned what he could, concealed other remnants in the metal-lined pit behind the barn, and cataloged details in his ledger. Dates, weights, observations, coded to resemble entries for cattle. Everything had a reason. Everything had a pattern. The body was gone. The drifter's absence was invisible to the authorities. No report had been filed. A missing transient in a sprawling, sparsely populated county was easy to overlook. This first kill changed Hale. He did not feel guilt. He felt precision, efficiency, and an idea took root. The cellar could hold more than storm supplies. The ledger could record more than cattle. Over the next months, he refined his approach. Each victim would be a calculation, isolated, unnoticed, unmissed. The cellar would become a controlled environment. He would become both hunter and guardian of his secret. By the end of that winter, Thomas Hale was no longer just a farmer. He was something else entirely. A man who understood that control could be absolute, and that the world outside rarely looked too closely. The first kill remained a secret for 20 years. Even when, decades later, the bones surfaced in the Neches River, no one suspected the depth of what had been buried beneath the quiet farmhouse all those years. After the first incident, Thomas Hale's confidence grew steadily. The cellar beneath his farmhouse was no longer merely a storage space. It had become a calculated instrument of control. Over the next several years, he honed his methods, learning when to approach, when to observe, and how to ensure that each person who crossed his threshold vanished without a trace. It began subtly. A traveling mechanic in 1965, seeking a place to repair his truck, accepted Hale's offer of assistance. Hale suggested he stay overnight in the cellar for safety. The man's presence was brief, but Hale's control over the space and his awareness of timing and preparation had grown. By the time the mechanic was gone, Hale had refined restraint methods, concealment strategies, and disposal techniques that made discovery nearly impossible. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, a similar pattern emerged. Young hitchhikers, wandering laborers, and transient workers appeared at the farm, often tired, alone, and willing to accept help. Hale offered employment, shelter, or a warm meal. Once inside, the cellar ensured they would not leave. Each act was deliberate, measured, and executed with calm precision. By now, the ledger had evolved. It recorded dates, weights, and coded observations, disguised as normal farm bookkeeping. Entries that might seem like cattle records contained hidden notes about his visitors. Hale's understanding of human behavior, combined with his experience in handling livestock, allowed him to work quickly and quietly. There were no cries that reached beyond the thick walls, no footprints leading away, no immediate suspicion. Hale also experimented with disposal methods. Some remains were burned in the pit behind the barn, others concealed in thick layers of soil or under composting material. Occasionally, he blended portions of flesh with ground beef for his farm customers, a risk calculated carefully, limited to discreet sales where trust had been established. He justified it in his mind as efficiency, a way to avoid waste, and a demonstration of his control. By the late 1970s, the county had grown. Highways carried more travelers through Hardin County. Oil field crews, seasonal harvesters, and wandering drifters came and went. Hale observed the patterns. Who traveled alone? Who left little trace? Who could disappear without alarm? The cellar had become a tool, a sanctuary of secrecy, and a proving ground for his careful orchestration. Despite the gravity of his actions, Hale maintained his public persona. At church, he offered help. At markets, he sold beef and shared smiles. Neighbors trusted him. Authorities had no reason to suspect. His dual life was perfectly balanced. An ordinary farmer by day, a predator by night. His crimes hidden in plain sight. 20 years of practice had turned initial improvisation into routine. Each abduction, each disappearance, reinforced the method, refining the timing, the tools, and the mindset. Hale's world was small, ordered, and under his control. A dangerous symmetry between the life everyone saw and the secret he maintained beneath the farmhouse. And yet, even in these years of absolute precision, the first hint of imperfection, an unexpected witness, a stray fragment, was already beginning to creep toward discovery, a shadow looming over 2 decades of silence. By the early months of 1982, Sheriff Walter Briggs had begun noticing connections in what had once seemed like random disappearances. The discovery of a single human femur in the Neches River had reopened old files, revealing a subtle pattern spanning decades. 4 cases immediately stood out. The 1978 disappearance of a traveling mechanic, the 1974 disappearance of a teenage hitchhiker, the mid-1970s vanishing of a seasonal farmhand, and, most recently, several unreported transients from the 1960s whose absences had gone unnoticed until the files were re-examined. All had last been seen near small country roads leading to farmland adjacent to tributaries of the Neches. Briggs called his deputies together. "Something's connecting these cases," he said, tapping the map. "See this creek? And this farm over here? Start there." The farm in question was Thomas Hale's, A modest property, white wooden farmhouse, barn, storage shed, and the kind of neatly tended land that gave the impression of order and reliability. Hale was known throughout the county, dependable, helpful, and involved in church activities. There was no reason to suspect him, yet patterns rarely lie. A neighbor recalled seeing Hale's refrigerated truck parked unusually close to the northern creek one morning years ago. Another remembered a strong smell of smoke in the air late at night near the burn pit behind the barn. Individually, these details seemed trivial. Together, they formed the beginnings of a trail. Briggs also interviewed longtime townsfolk. Many remembered transient workers or hitchhikers stopping at Hale's farm, sometimes asking for food or short-term labor. Most of them had disappeared. No complaints, no reports. Nothing that would trigger suspicion at the time. The sheriff began compiling a timeline: dates of disappearance, last known locations, and possible routes. Overlaying these on the map revealed a chilling concentration around the Hale property. Briggs knew the next steps would be delicate. Hale was respected. Accusations needed proof, or the sheriff risked making a grave mistake. But the growing pattern could not be ignored. Something, or someone, had been operating with remarkable consistency for decades. Meanwhile, Hale went about his daily routine as if nothing had changed. Cattle were fed, fences repaired, and his ledger maintained with meticulous care. He sensed nothing, or so he allowed himself to believe. But the renewed attention to the river and the missing persons files created a subtle shift, a distant rumble beneath the calm of his ordered life. That rumble was only the beginning. As Briggs pursued the pattern, it became increasingly clear. Whoever had been responsible for these disappearances had calculated every move, hidden every trace, and remained invisible to the very community that trusted him most. And the closer the sheriff got to the truth, the tighter the net would slowly close around Thomas Hale's carefully maintained facade. Sheriff Briggs had spent weeks reviewing old files, mapping disappearances, and cross-referencing witness statements. By now, Thomas Hale had become more than just a name on a list. He was the first person the sheriff needed to speak with. Hale arrived at the sheriff's office in the late morning, wearing his usual plain work shirt and jeans. His expression was calm, almost cordial, as though he were attending a routine meeting rather than being called in for questioning about multiple disappearances spanning 20 years. Briggs greeted him, keeping his tone neutral. "Morning, Mr. Hale. Mind if we ask you a few questions about your property and the people who might have stopped by over the years?" Hale smiled faintly. "Of course. Anything to help." At first, the conversation seemed ordinary. Hale recalled names, laborers, travelers, and occasional hitchhikers he had offered work. He spoke of chores completed, fences repaired, and farmhands' temporary stays. But small inconsistencies began to surface. Dates that did not match logs, vague recollections about people who supposedly left early, and contradictory details about the paths travelers had taken. Briggs noted every detail. The calm of Hale's demeanor only heightened the tension. It was a practiced calm, almost too deliberate. Later, a neighbor came forward. He had noticed smoke rising from Hale's burn pit late at night several years ago, and remembered a strong chemical-like odor he could not identify. At the time, he thought nothing of it. Now, it was significant. With these pieces, Briggs sought a search warrant. Evidence needed to be solid, or Hale's reputation and the community's trust could obstruct the case. He worked with the county attorney, presenting the patterns, witness accounts, and circumstantial connections. Finally, the judge signed the warrant. That evening, Hale returned to his farmhouse. He moved through the rooms as usual, feeding cattle, checking fences, and preparing dinner. Something in the air hinted at change, though he would not acknowledge it aloud. For 20 years, his routine had kept him safe. Now, it faced scrutiny. In the cellar, Hale inspected the locks and metal reinforcements, running a hand along the walls as if sensing the approaching attention. The room smelled faintly of dust, concrete, and old wood, nothing of the chaos that lay beneath the surface. He made a note to review the ledger later, ensuring entries were consistent with farm activity, not the reality they concealed. Sheriff Briggs, meanwhile, prepared his deputies for the visit. They would inspect the barn, the cellar, the burn pit, every place where Hale's careful secrecy could leave traces. The calm of the evening settled over the farm. Hale ate dinner slowly, methodically, finishing each bite with deliberate care. Outside, the wind rustled through the pasture, carrying the scent of damp grass and the distant river. Unseen, the first threads of investigation were beginning to tighten. The careful balance Hale had maintained between public trust and private action was about to be tested. And for the first time in decades, there was the real possibility that the past 20 years would finally surface. Early the next morning, deputies and Sheriff Briggs arrived at Thomas Hale's farm with the search warrant in hand. The air was crisp, the kind of morning that made every sound sharp and deliberate. Hale watched from the porch as they approached, calm, hands folded, as if expecting a routine inspection. "Morning, Sheriff," he said quietly. "Everything all right?" Briggs nodded, showing the warrant. "We're just going to take a look around, Mr. Hale. We have questions about a few missing persons cases and some property along the creek." Hale's expression remained neutral. "Of course. I'll show you whatever you need." The deputies fanned out, inspecting barns, outbuildings, and the fences. The cattle moved uneasily, sensing the unfamiliar attention. Hale followed, keeping pace but saying little. Then they reached the cellar. The reinforced steel door was familiar to Hale, yet now it had become the focus of scrutiny. Briggs gestured, and Hale unlocked it. Inside, the cellar smelled faintly of dust and damp concrete, but other, more unsettling scents lingered faintly, masked by decades of careful cleaning. Metal rings bolted into the walls, crates, and shelves that once seemed mundane now suggested purpose beyond storage. Deputies began systematic searches. Behind stacked barrels, beneath floorboards, and in hidden compartments, they discovered objects that had no place in a simple farm cellar. Old clothing fragments, belts, shoes, items that could be linked to missing persons. A small ledger, previously hidden, contained dates and coded entries. On first glance, it resembled normal cattle records. Upon closer inspection, certain entries coincided suspiciously with the dates of disappearances. Hale watched silently, nodding slowly as Briggs and the deputies cataloged evidence. Finally, they approached the burn pit behind the barn. Hale had tried to cover it with fresh soil and wood, but years of careful disposal had left traces. Fragments of bone were visible where the soil had shifted. Experts would later confirm that the remains matched several missing persons previously recorded in the county files. Briggs stepped back, exhaling. This is more than I expected." Hale's calm did not waver. He allowed deputies to take photographs and carefully log the evidence, maintaining a composed, almost casual demeanor. By noon, Hale was placed in handcuffs. The arrest was quiet, professional, almost surreal. Neighbors passing by would later describe the scene as calm, ordinary, as if nothing had changed. Yet beneath the white farmhouse, decades of hidden actions had been unearthed. For Hale, the routine of control had ended. Every careful calculation, every hidden ledger, every discreet disposal, exposed. The facade of the respected, friendly farmer was gone. leaving only a man facing the consequences of a lifetime of secrecy. That day marked the beginning of the formal investigation that would lead to trial. Evidence collected from the cellar, the burn pit, and the ledger would form the backbone of the case against Thomas Hale. The calm, quiet farm, so long a mask, now bore the weight of discovery. The investigation into Thomas Hale's crimes moved quickly once the evidence from his farm was in official hands. Forensic teams carefully examined every item recovered from the cellar, the burn pit, and hidden compartments. Clothing, shoes, personal effects, and bone fragments were meticulously cataloged. Each piece was cross-referenced with missing persons reports dating back 2 decades. The first breakthrough came when a fragment of a femur matched dental records of a teenage hitchhiker who had disappeared in 1974. It was the first confirmed victim. Over the next weeks, experts identified 3 additional victims: the 1978 traveling mechanic, a seasonal farmhand from 1975, and another transient who had vanished in 1967. Each identification relied on careful comparison of bone fragments, personal items, and archival records from the sheriff's office. Hale was interrogated repeatedly during this period. His demeanor remained unusually calm. He offered explanations that were careful, measured, and misleading. Yet investigators began to notice subtle admissions. He never outright denied the killings, nor did he claim insanity or coercion. Instead, he presented his actions as methodical and, in his mind, justified. Deputies examined the ledger Hale had kept. At first glance, it appeared to be a routine record of cattle weights and sales. Upon careful inspection, investigators noticed that certain entries corresponded precisely to the dates when the missing persons had been last seen. Each coded remark provided a chilling glimpse into Hale's mind, his system of control and concealment meticulously recorded in plain sight. The burn pit was examined under controlled conditions. Soil samples and ash contained traces of human bone and tissue, confirming suspicions that Hale had used the pit to dispose of remains over many years. Chemical tests revealed traces of substances intended to accelerate decomposition. Every discovery strengthened the case, proving that Hale had maintained a consistent and deliberate method for his crimes. By the end of the month, investigators had compiled a full report. The ledger, the personal effects, and the forensic findings established Hale's responsibility for 4 confirmed murders. The other disappearances could not yet be directly tied to him, but the pattern was unmistakable. During one questioning session, Hale spoke calmly, almost philosophically, about his crimes. "They were people no one looked for," he said. "I gave them a place where they wouldn't be a problem. That's all." No remorse was evident, only a meticulous pride in the system he had built. The case against Hale was now airtight in terms of the 4 confirmed victims. With the evidence cataloged, the sheriff's office prepared to present it to the district attorney. A trial would follow, and the careful planning that had concealed Hale's actions for 2 decades would now be scrutinized in a courtroom. While investigators worked, Hale returned to the farm under guard for a final inventory of remaining items. The same calm precision that had marked his life governed his movements. To anyone watching, he appeared simply as the methodical farmer they had always known. But beneath that calm, the weight of exposure had begun to touch him. Even a mind disciplined for decades could not fully anticipate the consequences of evidence, testimony, and forensic science converging at once. The trial was approaching, and with it, the final unraveling of a life built on secrecy, control, and unchallenged authority. By late summer of 1982, Thomas Hale's case had reached the courtroom. The small Hardin County courthouse was crowded with townspeople, journalists, and law enforcement. Even in a county accustomed to quiet rural life, the story of a seemingly trustworthy farmer who had secretly killed for 20 years drew attention. Hale entered the courtroom calmly, dressed in a gray suit. hair neatly combed, expression unreadable. His eyes scanned the room briefly, but betrayed nothing. To most observers, he still appeared the quiet, dependable man they had known. Only the evidence and the gravity of the charges revealed the truth lurking beneath that facade. The prosecution began with the ledger. Photographs of coded entries and cross-reference dates with missing persons were presented to the jury. Forensic experts explained the identification of remains from the cellar and the burn pit. Clothing fragments, personal items, and bone samples were shown, each linked to a confirmed victim. The pattern of disappearances, the deliberate concealment of remains, and Hale's own recorded entries painted a consistent, chilling picture. Witnesses recounted years-old memories. Neighbors who remembered transient workers stopping at Hale's farm, faint smoke from the burn pit, and strange smells late at night. Each recollection, combined with forensic evidence, reinforced the prosecution's argument that Hale had acted deliberately and systematically. The defense attempted to frame Hale as a man burdened by isolation and past trauma. They argued that he had never intended harm, suggesting instead that his actions were motivated by a warped sense of responsibility. Psychologists testified, examining his behavior and mental state. Hale, when questioned, remained composed. He did not deny the acts, but spoke with a quiet rationality, insisting he had acted with order and necessity, leaving little room for conventional empathy. Cross-examination highlighted inconsistencies in Hale's explanations, as well as his carefully orchestrated concealment methods. The jury was presented with the reality of decades of premeditation and the deliberate manipulation of circumstances to avoid detection. Days of testimony, evidence, and expert analysis culminated in closing arguments. The prosecution emphasized the cold calculation, the number of victims, and the 20-year span during which Hale had maintained secrecy. The defense reiterated his composed demeanor, his service to the community, and his self-claimed rationale. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Hale remained silent, his face unreadable. The foreperson spoke clearly. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Hale, guilty of 4 counts of murder." The judge, maintaining solemnity, announced the sentence: 15 years for each count, to be served consecutively, followed by the death penalty by lethal injection. Hale's calm never faltered. He heard the pronouncement as though observing events from a distance, detached, measured, and resigned. Outside, the press documented the story. Neighbors expressed disbelief. How could a man they trusted, a pillar of their small community, have carried out such acts undetected for 20 years? The combination of forensic science, meticulous investigation, and witness testimony had uncovered a carefully constructed secret, forever altering the county's perception of their quiet farmland. For Hale, the courtroom was the final stage. His life of careful routines, hidden crimes, and private dominion was now fully exposed. The public judgment, grounded in evidence and methodical investigation, left no room for the concealment he had mastered for decades. After the trial, Thomas Hale was transferred to the state penitentiary under heavy guard. The county of Hardin struggled to absorb the reality. The friendly, reliable farmer they had known for decades had secretly committed murders spanning 20 years. Inside the prison, Hale maintained his routine. He read, wrote in a journal, and meticulously planned his days. The control that had defined his life on the farm now applied to the small space of his cell. Yet the weight of exposure and the certainty of punishment pressed upon him. In his final months, Hale requested to speak with investigators in a controlled setting. His admissions were measured. He acknowledged responsibility not only for the 4 confirmed victims presented at trial, but for additional disappearances across the 2 decades, cases that had never been solved. The pattern of his crimes, previously hidden, was now fully revealed. Investigators documented the confessions carefully, adding closure for families who had long endured uncertainty and grief. Hale spoke calmly, almost philosophically, about his rationale. "They were people no one searched for," he said. "I gave them a place, and the world never noticed. I kept order where chaos existed." His tone was detached, clinical. No remorse was evident, only a meticulous explanation of his methods. In the county, life slowly returned to routine. Neighbors still whispered about the farmhouse. Journalists revisited the story, recounting the discovery in the river, the ledger, the cellar, and the burn pit. The farm, once a symbol of trust and reliability, had become a stark reminder of how appearances could mask hidden horrors. The legal system proceeded with the final sentencing. Hale received 15 years for each confirmed murder, served consecutively, followed by the execution by lethal injection. In prison, he remained quiet, disciplined, and calm until the day the sentence was carried out. The community, though shaken, found solace in justice. Families of the victims, long left in uncertainty, received confirmation of their loved ones' fates. The sheriff and deputies who had painstakingly investigated the case reflected on the importance of diligence, patterns, and attention to small details that, when combined, revealed the truth behind decades of secrecy. Hale's farm was eventually abandoned. The white farmhouse stood silent, fences falling into disrepair, and the burn pit filled in. The river continued to flow, indifferent to the decades of hidden crimes it had once carried silently along its banks. Though Thomas Hale was gone, his story remained, a chilling reminder that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, that trust can be a mask for malevolence, and that even the quietest corners of the world may harbor darkness beneath a calm surface. Hardin County moved forward, cautious and watchful, forever marked by the knowledge that evil can live undetected for years, even behind the most familiar and trustworthy faces.